Oshawa strategic plan called Creating a Sustainable Tomorrow. As a policy advisor for the Oshawa Environmental Advisory Committee and the founding chair of Durham's Environmental Advisory Committee, just to name a few of her involvements. Suzanne provides corporate and community environmental leadership and is a strong advocate for environmental awareness, stewardship, and action. Suzanne?
Good evening, and thank you for being here tonight. Okay, good? Yeah? I want to thank everybody here for being here tonight. I know it's a busy night, and I'm really pleased with the turnout. So we're just going to start quickly, okay? So, Bill McGibbon's film is very high level. We talk about global issues, but I think it's really important to understand what it means locally, why we should care. So this is a greenhouse, a lovely thing, we all love them. The bottom line is that without the greenhouse effect on our planet, we really wouldn't exist here. This is important for life. It really helps capture the sun's radiation and keeps just enough, or used to keep just enough to keep us warm and safe and cozy here. That little atmosphere is the only thing that separates us from the void of space. And when we lie on our backs and look up at space, it looks like a really big place. And even on the McGibbon film, it seems like a much bigger atmosphere. Bottom line is, our atmosphere is no thicker than the dew on an apple. That is the only thing that separates us from the void of space. That's what it would look like if we didn't have that little thin dew skin. Again, remember this apple. It's about balance. The problem that we have is we have been loading our atmosphere with carbon, as you just saw in the movie. A lot of it comes from transportation. Transportation gets most when we talk about oil, we talk about big oil, we talk about the oil industry, but the bottom line is that the greatest percentage of carbon is coming from our buildings. For the city of Oshawa, 73% of our carbon comes from the buildings that we own, and 10% comes from our fleet and vehicles. And then there's, of course, breeding habits. Methane, cow farts, 23 times more potent than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. And then there's garbage. One of the reasons why we strive to recycle is garbage is another major source of methane. Again, 23 times more potent as greenhouse gas. This is how quickly carbon concentrations have been increasing in the atmosphere. And it's not just carbon concentrations. It's pretty much everything. Population, water use, natural disasters, cost of insurance. All of these things have gone up dramatically. And in the Trudeau Strongman Free, we like to think we're really good about this stuff. Well, not so much. It is the rate of the change, as you saw in the previous slide, that makes it so important that we do something immediately. So, rate of change. In Canada, since we first became aware of this stuff, our carbon emissions have increased 26.2%, making us the second largest carbon producer per capita in the world, Canada. And what does it all mean? To quote our dear friend Dr. Stephen Schneider, who was one of the climate scientists who, along with Jim Hansen, first brought this to our attention 25 years ago. Warmer, wetter, cooler, drier. The problem is we don't know where and we don't know when. And that's the big issue. It is the unpredictability of climate change that is our biggest issue. And that's the thing that we need to worry about most locally, because we look at Calgary floods, this is in June. These were climate change. The insurance costs, this isn't the federal contribution or the provincial contribution, the insurance costs for this puppy were $1.7 billion. And then there's Toronto. Another epic flood this past summer. What does it all mean? Well, it means the cost of virtually everything is going to go up. So if you want to talk about it in terms of a large global issue, that's one thing. That I was actually at Durham Region on Tuesday this week, it's Waste Reduction Week, and I had a senior person from there tell me that they were really glad that I was there because they wanted to straighten me out about climate change. Because really, there's no such thing. And what happened was when communism fell in the 1990s, all those loose communists needed something to do, so they took on climate change. I'm so glad Brian Kelly wasn't there because they killed him. 2012, hottest summer in record in the United States, drove up the cost of corn by 30%. Virtually everything we have has some relation to corn, whether it's the beef that we eat or our food, huge, and that's just one item. What else does it mean? Well, emerald ash borer. Emerald ash borer is an invasive species from China that has no known predators. And the problem is it also has no wintering off. Thanks to warmer climates, this is decimating. It has a 100% infection rate and almost a 99% mortality rate. Came across as a vector in, I think, 2007, 2008 in Windsor, and it will now affect every tree in Durham region. City of Oshawa has about a 9% ash canopy. Cities like Ajax are 17%. If you don't treat it, the trees are dead, and the trees will die if you stop treating it. Treatment can be up to $500 a tree. Out in BC, pine beetle. This is what the wonderful mountains look like in the Rockies now. We were out there a few years ago. I was giving a presentation, and then Tech and I went, oh look, fall came early. No, these are pine trees, and they're dying. There are entire mountains in BC that are now devoid of trees. In fact, they estimate that BC will lose 80% of its evergreens. And then there's the subsequent fires that cause huge. You think fossil fuel industries can contribute in carbon? Wait till the fires. Well, Canada, they are telling us that within the next 25 years, we may lose our national icon to climate change. Can you imagine a world without trees? And that's just the tip of the climate change iceberg. So, remember the apple? This isn't a huge, big environment we can keep throwing stuff into. It's very thin, and the impacts will be dramatic, and it will be very local. So, you saw the report that Price Waterhouse, we talked about 2 degrees is too much. They're now talking 6 degrees. 6 degrees. We have no idea what that means. It means increase in costs in everything. Food, transportation, education, virtually everything that we do. You want an economic argument to fight climate change? It's right there. This is what our future could possibly look like. And the only people who can do something about it are you. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. That's great. So next up, to my right, is Brian Kelly, the Manager of Sustainability for the region of Durham, and he brings 42 years of professional experience to the table. Before becoming the Manager of Sustainability, he was the Interim Director for Climate Change, the Founding Director for the Sustainable Enterprise Academy at York University, the Director of Environment and Sustainable Development for Ontario Hydro, and the founder of Pollution Probe. Again, just to name a few of his accomplishments. His background in teaching, consulting, business, government, and non-government organizations provides a unique combination of professional specializations. It well positions Brian to combat the multifacets of the climate crisis.
Thank you, Victoria. The movie we saw and Suzanne's unique summary of that are both humbling and, I think, strangely inspiring as well. I'm going to try to bring this down to region of Durham, tell you very quickly a little bit about what we are trying to do in the region of Durham. There are some significant uphill battles to be won yet, but I think we are taking this quite seriously. So that's an overview of our plan. This has been underway for 2 or 3 years, and I should at this point stop and acknowledge Regional Councillor Don Mitchell from Whitby, who's in the audience, along with Elizabeth Roy, local councillor from Whitby. Don is the chairman of our Durham Region Roundtable on Climate Change. That is the organization that's spearheading this work within the region and across the lower tier municipalities as well. So that's our activity diagram. As you can see, in 2013, we are at the point of beginning to implement a number of proposed programs within our climate action plan, and that's this document here. There are some copies outside. We are also launching this year the companion plan, a climate adaptation plan, because as Bill McGibbon said, it's too late to stop it. We are going to experience significant climate change, and we now need to turn part of our attention, not all of it, part of it towards how are we going to cope with or adapt to the inevitable changes. So we're beginning that sort of work as well. This goes back to a vision that was created about 3 years ago, that Durham region will be a carbon neutral, sustainable, prosperous, and resilient community with a high quality of life. A unique combination of objectives, but speaking to the synergies between protecting the climate, economic development, cleaner environment, saving money, all of those sorts of things which go together. It is not a trade-off, as many people still think it is. We have set some targets for our community, 5% reduction in GHG emissions by 2015. That won't be hard to meet. A 20% reduction by 2020, and that 80% reduction that you saw Bill McGibbon talking about, which comes from the International Panel on Climate Change, of an 80% reduction by 2050. We went through a couple of years of consultation, program development, and design to produce this document, which is our climate action plan for the community in Durham. It has 18 potential programs in it, only one of which has been approved and modestly funded at this point. There are another 17, which I'll introduce you to in a moment. I will note towards the end of that slide that if this plan is fully implemented, it can meet our 2020 targets of 20% reduction in GHGs, and that's twice as good as the federal government plan is projected to meet. I need to point out that we have a plan in this document. This is a plan, it is not yet a program. There are, as I mentioned, 18 programs. One is approved. We need to work on the rest. They all require much further development, funding, support, collaboration, etc. That's the list of 18. We have one that's approved, the Durham Partners in Project Green. It is focused on our business community, and Durham Sustainability is our delivery agent for that program. It is one of our few local NGOs working in this space. There are 5 other programs in green that are our top priorities for this year. Developing a comprehensive residential retrofit program for doing significant deep retrofits on all many residential, perhaps not all, many residential buildings across Durham. A local food hub, urban agriculture program, don't get Suzanne going on that one. A Durham 5 million trees program. 5 million trees sounds like a lot, but it will increase our forest cover by 1%. It will move it from 26% to 27%. The target in our official plan is 30%. We don't even know how we're going to get to 30%. We're proposing to plant over the next decade 5 million trees in Durham, and that will sequester some carbon, help to stabilize the environment, all the good things that trees do, and it will increase our forest cover from 26 to 27%. Big deal. And lastly, a climate education program. There are other programs in there. I don't have time to go into them. I don't want to monopolize the conversation because I want you to ask the questions you want. But there are some fairly significant programs there on a new green building guideline for Durham, offshore wind power generation, deep lake water cooling, biofuel program, growing our fuel on our significant agricultural base in Durham, and a number of other activities. Ask me about them if you want more. That's a one-page summary of the Do the Math film. Copy here, about 25 copies out at the table outside if you want a one-page takeaway. I want to raise the ante, though, a little bit. I want to talk about ideas beyond this document that are worthy of the challenge that Bill McKibben laid down to us in that film. Some may think these are rather radical ideas, but I think they are only at the level that we need to engage discussion in the future. The notion of a carbon fee, or heaven forbid, I use the term carbon tax, in Durham or in Southern Ontario or in the GTA, where we apply a charge on carbon emissions that's equal only to the current charge in the province of British Columbia of $30 a ton, and make it a revenue-neutral carbon tax, return it to people through property tax rebates, but send that economic signal, capture at least part of those externalities that were mentioned a number of times in the film. If that's a little too radical for you, what about the idea of a shadow price on carbon in the Durham region? So when we're making decisions about new infrastructure, new buildings, how efficiently we build our buildings, what our transit systems looks like, at least we factor in the future price of carbon, or factor in those externalities when making the decision in the form of what economists call a shadow price. What about fuel pump labels? The Durham Roundtable had a presentation from a young upstart group called Our Horizon. That's a play on the BP Deepwater Horizon in the Gulf of Mexico. They want to put simple little labels on that little square that's on the back of the fuel pump that you hold when you're filling up your car. Right now it advertises, cheap chips and pop in the store. What if we reminded people that the act that they're engaging in of standing there staring at this thing for the 3 minutes it takes to fill up the tank, remind them of the implications of that fuel that they're putting in the tank? Simple, virtually costless thing that might have some very significant psychological impacts. What about our new community of Seton in North Pickering and making it a model sustainability community by invoking a number of these things, such as a shadow price on carbon, and making that the most efficient and renewable-based new demonstration community that we possibly could? What about the idea of a carbon-neutral Pickering Airport? We hear from Mr. Flaherty that we're going to have a Pickering Airport. Well, what about the objective of making it the world's first carbon-neutral airport, where we perhaps grow the jet fuel in the surrounding agricultural lands, and all of the buildings are run on renewable energy at high efficiency? What about the concept of a carbon-neutral airport? If we're going to have one, let's make the best of it. A green building code. The program calls for a green building guideline. What about the idea of having a Durham or a GTA building code that called for much higher levels of energy efficiency and renewable energy integration in new buildings? And lastly, since we're in an educational institution, I don't see a lot of college-age students in the audience, but I'm sure you all know what we refer to as Gen X and Gen Y. Well, I'm starting to call our student generation the 4F generation. What does 4F stands for? It stands for a future fucked by fossil fuels. Pardon my language. That's all I've got to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. I can certainly see how you're inspired when there are so many points of action that are actually attainable. So next, now to my left, we're going to move on to Sarah White. Sarah is a professor at the School of Science and Engineering Technology at Durham College, and she teaches a variety of courses including environmental protection, global wellness, and environmental regulations. She has a passion for environmental issues and is a dynamic and approachable instructor whose teaching style is well received by her students. Before joining the faculty team at Durham College, Sarah worked for several years in both environmental and management consulting industries.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I just want to talk about Durham College's sustainability initiatives. Durham College is committed to sustainability and reducing its environmental impact through our Living Green program, involving internal and external stakeholders through a variety of initiatives on campus and within the community. Okay, so this is a screenshot of our Living Green site through the Durham College website, and it outlines a number of initiatives that are ongoing. We have a campus green team, and we also produce our own energy in Whitby through renewable energy sources such as wind and solar power. And this can be viewed in real time through our Solar View Energy portal. So here we can see the amount of energy that is generated, as well as gasoline in liters saved. This is in real time, and we can also go to a screen that shows us on a 24-hour basis how much energy has been produced from wind and solar, how much revenue has been generated, and how much gasoline we have saved. Sorry, this is the screenshot of the 24-hour and the 1 year. We are also part of the STARS program, which is an international sustainability accreditation program based on a variety of parameters, anything from energy efficient buildings to waste management systems. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm really amazed every time I hear about new things happening at Durham College and the OEAC, which are just amazing, very high-level institutions. Okay, so next we're going to move on to Brendan Hickie. Brendan is a professor in the Environmental and Resource Studies program at Trent University, and he teaches a variety of courses related to climate change, including introductory environmental science, field and chemical methods, and pollution ecology. Specializing in e-toxicology, his research focuses on the environmental fate and effect of contaminants such as PVCs and mercury in aquatic ecosystems, and particularly in marine mammals such as the beluga and killer whales. In recent years, he has been a member of ArcticNet, a large Canadian research network examining the effects of climate change on Arctic ecosystems and people. Brendan?
Thank you. Welcome to Trent University, Oshawa. It's great to see you all out here tonight at our beautifully recycled building. I'm going to take a bit of a different tack. Rather than talking about Trent programs dealing with sustainability, I'd like to talk about what we can do collectively. And certainly one thing Trent has been heavily involved in for many years is in, of course, education, but specifically environmental education. Trent University had the first environmental science program at a Canadian university. While we're a small school, it is still one of our flagship academic programs, and we're very active in research and education. So there are lots of things that we as a community can do. There's lots of things that Trent University is involved in. So I'm going to focus on two things. One is education, and as an environmental science professor, I invariably get out there and I meet the skeptic at every party or gathering that gives me a hard time and backs me into a corner, always picking away at those little cherry pickings and ignoring the overwhelming evidence that climate change is real. The other thing is leave the message, we need to collectively change the political landscape. I've heard some great things about things going on in Durham region, Oshawa, Durham College, but this is a much broader thing. That climate change is a global issue, national issue, regional issue, and we need to get people thinking about it, aware and understanding, and push politicians. So under education, there was a lovely little quote of the documentary tonight: if you are ignorant, you get a pass. as an educator and having devoted my career to education, this really caught my attention, and we want to change that. So one thing that we get accused of teaching about the environment is that we're indoctrinating students. Well, no, we're not. We try to make students think, make decisions for themselves, weigh the evidence, come to conclusions. So we're not into the business of indoctrinating students, telling them what to think or how, but we're telling them how to go about the process of thinking about issues. Climate change deniers like to label themselves the skeptics. Science, by its nature, is a skeptical undertaking. We're always weighing the evidence, looking at alternative views, and coming to the most logical conclusion. We're the skeptics, not them. I'd just like to take a couple of minutes and visit one particular thing very near and dear to me. Climate change happens on many levels. In many cases, it's a very subtle thing. Young people don't necessarily see it. I tell my kids, when I was their age, I could go out and play hockey on the local rink at the local pond on Christmas Day. They can't. They never have. That's one little nugget. I work in the Arctic, and that's a map coming out of one climate change model predicting future trends and patterns. There's numerous models. They all point to the same thing, that the Arctic is going to be the place to look for climate change first and foremost, and indeed we are seeing that. The skeptics don't like to talk about that. They don't want to engage in a discussion about that. Here's a very telling issue. This was mentioned in the documentary tonight. Since we got satellite capabilities, we can take images of sea ice on a daily basis. We can map it out. We can calculate out the area. So between 1984 and 2012, we lost almost 50% of summer ice. So that's the minimum area. It's lost 50% in a couple of decades. It's huge. Put that in context of where we live. That's really drives it home, just how much ice has been lost. It gets even more telling when you look at the volume, because while the area has decreased, the thickness has also decreased. And because of that, the melting is accelerating almost every year. The ice was a little bit more extensive this year because climate is variable, and that's something that scientists have to contend with. In fact, I was accosted by our resident climate change skeptic last week saying, ice is up in the Arctic this year, and in fact it's up in Antarctica, it's all bunk. Well, I'm sorry, he's wrong. In fact, if you look at the records, this is the area in blue there is the range of predictions for ice loss in the Arctic from a variety of climate change models. The red is the actual. We're losing ice up there faster than any model predicts. And in fact, I was at a conference about 3 years ago, and there was one of the leading ice experts came out and said, if this continues, we will have an ice-free Arctic summer in about 30 years. Big reason for that kind of activity is what's called positive feedback. As you have less ice, the water warms up more because even though the Arctic is cold, open water absorbs heat, melts the ice faster. The more open water in the summer, the faster we lose the ice. The fossil fuel industry loves this. 2 years ago, our research icebreaker was able to traverse the Northwest Passage without breaking ice at the tail end of the summer. And this is the Beaufort Sea. That map there maps out areas that are opening up to oil and gas exploration in the coming years. The oil industry loves the fact that there's a longer open water season in which to do their work. So just a quick thing, a few tips on dealing with the skeptics out there. They're often very polished. There's a lot of money that goes into various groups of skeptics. If you go to their websites, they're often anonymously funded. It's often from ExxonMobil and friends. But there's a few things. These are tactics that they take. They always call it a conspiracy. I've worked with scientists for decades. We're not so organized. We'd never be able to, to organize any kind of conspiracy. We can't even figure out where to go for dinner most nights. They put out fake experts. Cherry picking. I'll give you an example of that in just a minute. They pick on the couple of things that they can go at you, and they ignore everything else. They ignore the overwhelming evidence. They say science is lousy, we can't answer questions. Well, science is very difficult. Predicting the future is especially difficult. And I like to tell my students, it's nothing more difficult than predicting the future. What's more difficult, predicting what's going to happen with our climate, or what year are the Maple Leafs going to win the cup? I don't know if we'll be around long enough for that one. Number 6 there is one I added, lack of consensus. In scientific literature, about 97% of it says climate change is real, it's happening, and there's increasing evidence it's driven by human activity. Climate change denial crowd says, lack of consensus. Okay, let's move on. Excellent book that deals with this came out a couple of years ago. It's called Merchants of Doubt. Highly recommend it. It's beautifully written, and it explains how climate change denial crowd has taken many of the lessons, many of the methods that the tobacco industry put to use to keep tobacco out there in use. And despite all the evidence, they still don't really acknowledge that tobacco causes cancer. And they're using all those same tactics with climate change. Here's the one I was accosted with, and some of my colleagues towards the back there know who our resident climate change denial person is. He's not here tonight. Thankfully, he'd be having a go at me. Came at me and said, Arctic ice is increasing. And I said, no, it's decreasing. He said, no, it's not. Go and look. So I went and looked, and Arctic ice is decreasing. He meant Antarctic, but, it's off by 20,000 kilometers, half a world. And indeed, he's correct. This year, Antarctic ice extent is larger than has been on record for a number of years. He was right. He says, see, it's all junk. It's junk science. How can the ice possibly be increasing in a warming climate? Well, it's increasing a little bit. What I showed you earlier, the Arctic ice is disappearing at about 11% a decade. That's growing in Antarctica. It's growing about 1% a decade. And Arctic and Antarctic are almost, well, they're opposite poles, but they're also opposite geographically in the sense that the Arctic Ocean is surrounded by land, whereas Antarctica is a continent surrounded by ocean. And they operate in very, very different ways. Wind and weather patterns can do strange things. It's just like in extremely cold winters, not that we have that many down here in the Great Lakes anymore, but in our coldest winters where the Great Lakes freeze over, we actually have less snow because we lose the lake effect. Warm it up a little bit, you get more snow. And try to explain that to somebody. The science gets very, very difficult, and getting people out there educated to make these points, to be able to counter these arguments, I think is very, very important. And I think our educational institutions have a role in that. So, just changing political landscape, variety of things. Get out there. You guys are out here tonight getting informed. Hopefully you're going to go to all candidates' meetings, municipal, provincial, federal elections, ask the tough questions. And unlike what we see in Parliament these days, demand real answers. I know it's a tough thing to do.
It's risky in Oshawa.
And I'll leave it with that.
Thank you, Brandon. I think most environmental advocates can attest, whether they deal with climate change directly or not, that no matter where we go, we deal with skeptics. I know it happens for me almost every day, so that's a great bit of advice. So last but certainly not least, we're moving on to Ralph Torrey. Ralph is the president of Torrey Smith Associates and has been involved in climate change issues since he co-authored the first comprehensive analysis of the potential for renewable energy in Canada in the early 1980s. An idea at that time, long before its time. And since then, he's been the deputy coordinator of the Energy Research Group of the United Nations University. He organized the Energy Workshop of the Toronto Conference and on the changing atmosphere, and the development of the first low-carbon scenario analysis for Canada. These achievements, among many others, earned him the Canadian Environment Silver Award.
Thank you. I forgot my reading glasses, so my notes look a bit like the future that we're all thinking about. It's kind of pretty blurry. No, I think I'm just going to wing it. Thanks, though. And as I was watching the film, and I had seen it before, and I've seen Bill in action before, and I was sitting there thinking, man, this is pretty hard to follow as a speaker. You can't, there's enough rhetoric in that movie to keep you going for a while. And there certainly would be no hope of improving on it. I also thought about all the information that surrounds this topic and how little time there is to really convey too much of that. Anyway, it's all on the internet. So I thought what I would do is just offer a few personal observations, not about the physics or the science or the technology, but about the psychology of this issue. And I've been involved in it now since the late 1980s. And it seems to me that first of all, there's been a lot of references to the skeptics and the climate change denial phenomenon. And I've had my own experience with that. I think it's actually quite understandable from a human point of view why the denial is so persistent, even in the face of what is now overwhelming scientific consensus that global warming is here, that it's being caused by human emissions of greenhouse gases primarily from our fossil fuel production and consumption, and that unless we curb those emissions, it will proceed to the point where it destabilizes global atmospheric systems on a scale which is very difficult to imagine in terms of the consequences and the implications to human civilization. Who would not want to deny that? Who would not want to deny that? And I came across some research a couple of years ago by a woman who calls herself an eco-psychologist. I'd never come across that term before, and since then I've been reading quite a bit in this field. And she had a very interesting observation, and those of you who have read any of George Lako's, Don't Think of an Elephant, will recognize some of the ideas here. And it's basically that the denial of climate change is actually coming from very, very deeply held points of view, what are sometimes called deep frames. The frames that we all carry around deep in our consciousness and subconsciousness that help us make sense of the world. And what she had noticed in her research was that the stronger the evidence got, and the stronger the consensus of scientific opinion on this issue became, the stronger the deniers denied the reality of climate change. Because it wasn't about the facts for them. they're not morons. Well, some of them are, but you know, there's morons in any random selection of the human population. But there are amongst the climate deniers people who are definitely not morons. And their denial of the scientific evidence and the scientific consensus is coming from a much deeper place in their consciousness and in their way of looking at the world than the simple weighing and evaluating of scientific evidence. Another type of response that you see to this issue, and we saw quite a bit of it in the film, is anger. It's an attempt to say, yes, it's real, and it's his fault. It's the fossil fuel industry's fault. And who can deny the obscenity of the salaries and the greed and the profits and the rapacious consequences of the fossil fuel industry in the world? And of course it makes us angry. But I also think of that Pogo cartoon from years ago that's so often quoted. We have met the enemy and the enemy is us. And the fact is, and there's an interesting letter written by the president of Harvard University last week in response to McKibben's campaign for divestiture, asking for Harvard University to divest itself of fossil fuel resources. And the Board of Governors of Harvard is not yet ready to do it. And one of the arguments that was put out there in response was, you know, we're all using this stuff. It isn't just the industry that produces it that is making this problem. We have developed a whole civilization, and it was referred to in the film and it's been referred to by some of the other speakers, that is so deeply and profoundly dependent now on very high-density forms of energy, in particular fossil fuels, that it's going to be extremely difficult. Well, I shouldn't say it's going to be extremely difficult, but it's extremely difficult to imagine getting beyond it. And so it's understandable that if it no longer becomes feasible to deny the problem, that you would try and externalize it and place all of the blame on an external corporate reality or an external part of the community, and then direct your anger at that, and it can be effective. And the divestiture campaign itself is probably one of the most effective campaigns going on in the world right now to draw attention to the climate change issue, and I support it for that reason. But at the same time, it leaves me wanting a little bit about whether getting angry at the fossil fuel industry by itself is a fully mature and human response to the problem that we're facing. Another type of